founded in Valencia in 1937, but there were a lot of informal gatherings before that. A lot of the women in the movement were already politically aware because this is in the context of the anarcho-syndicalist movement in Spain that was very popular at the time. And the movement was inspired by significant economic disparities as well as really bad working conditions. And the movement that was addressing these conditions at the time, called CNT, ignored the high percentage of women. So they branched off and tried to empower women to recognize their own potential and mobilize them into the broader anarchist movement.
So my section talked about the story of Lucia, who was considered an older professional woman. So she was really focused on the idea that men who treat their wives like servants in the home will treat women outside the home in the same way. And she says, quote, "You have to tell them that before reforming society, it is necessary to reform its house." So she was really also focused on the idea that women are individuals, not just products to produce children and then die. And then at the end of the section, she starts talking about the importance of education, and then that continues into the next.
Yeah, I kind of had Lucia's goal that she wanted to give women the education they needed in order to emancipate themselves as workers or women. Lucia also happened to be fighting the institution of marriage as a lesbian with a partner named America. And then I moved on to the next person, who was Mercedes, who kind of grew up with her father instilling humanism and concern for workers for her. Lucia and Mercedes met in a class that Lucia was going to teach, and got really interrupted by men, and they ended up bonding over that. That's how they got together. Mercedes' focus more so was on preparing women, enabling them to find their voice, encouraging them to take on the work of public speaking, writing, or action to engage others.
My part of the reading, I had two people. The first person, his name is Soledad, and Soledad recounted some of the most important things women did in the first hours and days of the revolution was to build barricades and go up to the roofs of buildings with paper microphones and call out to soldiers to come to our sides and take off their uniforms and join the people. And my second person, her name was Sarah. I don't know how to pronounce her last name. She did not join the organization until late 1937, and she was initially opposed to the idea of separate organizations for women. She's an example of many women who were caught up in the war and radicalized in the process. Her negative experiences with anarchist men led her to her active engagement with the organization. They argue that these new roles for women should not be limited to wartime necessity, but viewed as an opening opportunity for women to move permanently into what had traditionally been perceived as male-only public spaces.
This document wants you walking away with two ideas. The first one is that there's no solution to women's problems except economic. It talks about the movement's focus on offering education, job training, awareness of self-training, and addressing ignorance about sex and birth control. And the second idea that it wants you walking away with, and this is the final sentence of the whole document, it's talking about the interweaving of personal and political. Like, you cannot talk about politics without talking about people, and I think that's a point that is made most poignantly in the way that it's formatted, with like these like personal anecdotes from people in the movement. But there it is, explicitly, interweaving of personal and political.
All right. So, how did y'all feel about reading this? What did it make you feel?
I thought it was very, 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 like, I thought it was very, I'm not going to say significant, but I thought it was important for the time specifically, just because the like moving of feminism from the individual to like an entire community is like something that was not seen during that time, like 1930s. Like, there's no like entire like town just doing feminist shit. So it's like, I just thought that was very, very like groundbreaking for the time.
I think y'all also wanted to talk about how they're not they didn't want to be considered a feminist group?
Yeah, I think there was like a misconception during that time about what feminism actually was, and so that they thought that feminism was really just like pushing away the men in society or empowering them so much that they rise above men, which really isn't the case. And we know now that from learning what feminism actually is, their ideologies were very aligned with feminism.
Well, what I think is really interesting about that is that we're still having that problem today in modern day feminism. The fact that people think it is like man-hating or, some kind of like vendetta against men. So I think it's interesting that this was like what took place in the 1930s, and yet we're still having the same issue like basically 100 years later.
And especially like at like a phase of feminism, you know, where like it feels like it's like it should have been like so obvious, you know, like very much fighting for like maybe like material things, and it's like not to say that we don't now, you know, but like I feel like it's a lot less kind of like about social dynamics and stuff, and a lot more about like physical things that need to be done or accessible, you know.
Okay. How did you feel about it being written bilingually? Because I know that when I read it, it felt way more impactful. The moments that were in Spanish, like when I translated them, they just seemed so much more than like it just being all in English. But I don't know how you felt about it.
I mean,
Yeah, I thought it was. So what I did was I read all the English first, and then I went back and did the Spanish after, and I think that really impacted how I retained the knowledge of it, because it really was more important than I gave credit, I guess.
Like in your first read versus your second understanding?
Yeah, I thought some of the most powerful statements were definitely in Spanish. I mean, my section was mostly in English, but some of the most important quotes and the most impactful quotes were all in Spanish. So I thought that was interesting as well.
and it really puts you in the mindset of people that are learning overseas, because there's a very, very big like English bias in education, and English is really prioritized when teaching, and so again, like having to get my access to information by literally like having to go to a site to translate it and then putting it in the context of the document, it just really like helps you understand the difference in education in America and overseas.
I know we talked about feminism being relevant. Did anything seem irrelevant in this, like to us now, maybe at all?
Like any of the stuff that they were doing.
Doing or trying to fight for anything? I know it talked a lot more about just being a worker.
I think the only thing that I can think of is kind of like the being against marriage, I think, is a very backwards idea. I definitely understand it, and to some extent I do agree, because I think there's definitely a power shift to when you are married. But at the same time, I think it's like dependent on the idea that men will always be in power, and it takes away a lot. And I feel like it kind of perpetuates this man-hating idea, where it's like, I won't marry you, I can't be with you, because if I am, then I'm not truly a feminist, or like you're doing something wrong. So I don't necessarily agree with that.
Okay. Any final thoughts? No, we're good.